Thank you very much, Alberto. We had an interesting session this morning, partly about subjectivity. That's exactly what they meant, which is Alberto talking about me. Of course, it's impossible to live up to what he said, so I'm now I'm terrified of this auditorium. Thank you to Bruno Leoni, Istituto Bruno Leoni. The work you do is nothing short of amazing, and the reputation you have throughout the world is very well deserved, and let's hope it'll be very long lasting as well. So anyway, first of all, apologies for the lights. We realized during the break that these lights were not very bright, so in order to enhance their visibility a little bit and hopefully your ability to fall asleep, we had to dim them a little bit. So I'm sorry about the darkness. Anyway, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we face and freedom faces today. They are several, of course. I'm only going to talk about 2 or 3. There are many more, but these I think are some of the key ones, and I think they're going to pose a great challenge in the years to come, because many people who supposedly stand for freedom are now standing for the opposite of freedom. They have gained a certain authority in the field of freedom. They have an audience, they have followers, and they have voters. And they are now defending the exact opposite of what freedom, at least to most people in this room, is supposed to mean. So that's why I talk about the times of confusion. And I'm going to start with monetary policy. And I think if I had to single out one major assault on freedom today throughout the world, it's monetary policy. I think central banks and governments in general, because there's this illusion that central banks operate with a certain degree of autonomy from central governments, and that's not really true anywhere. There are many connections between the two institutions, and certainly monetary policy is also part of the political stage. But I think this is a major assault on freedom today, and I think the consequences will be long-lasting. I think they will be very traumatic, and I think it's incredibly important for us to try and communicate to people not only the danger of what's going on, but also exactly why we are repeating many of the errors of the past, perhaps under the guise of apparently new or different ideas. So the financial crisis in 2008 was a wonderful opportunity. It was a very troubling period, and it hurt many people throughout the world. We should never forget that. But it was also a great opportunity. It was a great opportunity to finally bury Keynesian ideas and monetarist ideas from the point of view of Austrians, of course, and libertarians in general, classical liberals in general. Because those two paradigms had been very authoritative. They had gained a lot of respect throughout the world, and certain periods in recent history and recent memory were identified with those two paradigms in one way or another. And many people, not everybody of course, thought that those ideas had been applied successfully to overcome challenges in the field of economics throughout recent history. So it was a perfect moment to dispel the notion that Keynesian ideas were the way to combat a recession, and it was also a wonderful opportunity to combat the idea that monetarist ideas were the way to combat a recession. And I'm going to be very simplistic, of course. Inevitably, we don't have much time. If we had to define Keynes' ideas in 2008, well, basically they would have to do with the importance, of course, of boosting aggregate demand in order to boost economic activity. And the enemies of aggregate demand in times of recession, of course, are several. But some of them, we know them very well, and they have very nice and neatly defined terms, such as the paradox of thrift, which is actually not an idea that Keynes invented. This idea emerged in the 18th century, probably even before that, but Mandeville, in The Fable of the Bees, took it up. And it's a recurring idea through modern history, of course, but Keynes popularized it very much, the idea of the paradox of thrift, meaning that saving was a bad thing. Saving money and boosting savings in times of recession was a way to impede, to hamper the economic dynamics of a country. And therefore, it was important to neutralize, to counter the tendency of people to save money, particularly in times of recession. And he also spoke about something that some of his followers later on called the liquidity trap. Many people think that he came up with this term. He didn't come up with this term in the general theory. It's not there. But the idea is there. And it has to do with the notion that monetary policy is useless when you are in a context of a deep recession in which interest rates have been going down and down and down through government action. And it really comes to a point where you get to 0% or almost 0% interest rates, and people simply don't react to monetary policy anymore. For instance, monetary policy through the manipulation of interest rates, basically purchasing or selling government bonds. Well, people don't want to buy bonds. They prefer cash. They prefer the most liquid asset they can get their hands on, and the most liquid asset, of course, is cash. So liquidity trap means that the government is unable to influence behavior through open market operations and through the manipulation or adjustment of interest rates. People are simply going to save money. They have the expectation of deflation, of price deflation. They have the expectation that interest rates will eventually go up, in which case the bonds will lose value. So the general idea being that the government knows better than the people themselves what the people need to do with money in times of recession. And the monetarist idea, of course, you know it very well as well. And Friedman, unfortunately, was one of the great champions of this idea. He was such an extraordinary defender of freedom in so many fields, and as people who value freedom, we owe him an immense debt of gratitude, of course. But I think in this particular field, he contributed to confusion immensely. Of course, in his famous monetary history of the United States with Anna Schwartz and elsewhere, his view of the Great Depression is one that had to do with what he believed was the failure of the Federal Reserve, of the central bank, to boost monetary aggregates through the manipulation of the monetary base. He thought the Fed should have done a lot more to expand money in that context, and he thought the failure to do that had generated severe consequences, turning what was a mild recession or would have been a passing recession into a decade-long depression. So monetarists believe in general, of course, that monetary aggregate determine GDP, determine economic growth. So the way to get stable growth is to get stable money growth. But in turn, and you need to adjust it depending on what the situation is. In times of inflation, of course, you need to adjust it. But in times of deflation, you need to adjust it too. And hence the idea that in times of recession, you need to boost monetary aggregates through government action. Again, the idea that government knows better than the people's subjective choices what the people should do in order to get out of a recession. So 2008, we had what really turned out to be the Great Recession. And this was a great opportunity, of course, to understand that past recessions had not been overcome through Keynesian or monetarist policies or ideas. And yet, unfortunately, we missed this great opportunity. And we engaged in both. And we now find ourselves almost, 9 years down the road, and we still have not overcome the Great Recession. We're not exactly at a point where technically we can call it a recession, but we really are still living through a very, very tough economic period in which I think it can be safely said that we are still suffering the consequences of that economic crisis, in large part because of government action and government failure to understand what the real causes of it were, and failure to understand what that approach, its Keynesian and monetarist approach, had done in previous recessions, particularly during the Great Recession. So I'm just going to show quickly some slides here to show you what's been going on. We start with the Keynesian side of this. Of course, boosting government spending tremendously in the first few years. It's still going on, by the way, in many countries, but I'm basically focusing on the period in which this was most visible. And this was really the first reaction that governments everywhere had, particularly, of course, in the developed world, on both sides of the Atlantic. The idea was we need to boost government spending, we need fiscal policy is the way to overcome the recession. And look at these numbers. I mean, the amount of fiscal stimulus, or the various stimuli, depending on what country you're talking about, is huge. We're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6%, 7%, and in the case of China, 12% of GDP. And this was in a very short period of time. So it's a huge amount of fiscal spending, entirely aimed at at getting people into economic activity quickly. We know, of course, today that it simply did not happen, and this is a massive failure of Keynesian fiscal policy to overcome the Great Recession. But then we went for the other solution, the monetarist solution, the monetary solution. Of course, the monetarists do not believe that fiscal policy is the way to overcome a recession. In fact, they reject that notion, but they do believe that monetary policy is the way to reject it. Well, we had both. This is the second policy. And look what happened in the United States. The one way to measure it is to simply see, you know that by law, banks need to keep a reserve at the central bank, which is a percentage of their deposits, of the money in the system. And one way to measure the way the government is boosting the money stock is to see how the assets are growing, how the balance sheet of the central bank is growing, and then you can see how the excess reserves are simply piling up on a colossal way. Depending on how you measure it and depending where you start, the central bank in the United States, the Fed, has quadrupled or quintupled the amount of excess reserves. So it's unprecedented in history. We've had periods in which monetary policy was used to this effect, but this is on a colossal scale. We've never seen anything like this before. And look at what's happened. Economic activity has not picked up in a significant way. So they have, instead of learning from their mistake, they have continued to pile on the excess reserves in the United States. But exactly the same thing has happened of course, in Europe. Again, this is the explosive growth of the balance sheet, in this case of the European Central Bank, emulating policy in the United States and policy, by the way, in other parts of the world too, including, of course, Japan. And Japan has been doing it for decades now. So, again, a complete failure to look at the real world, to look at what's been happening in other parts of the world and see how policies have been affecting negatively or positively economic activity. In the case of the United States, one way to see the complete inability of monetarist policy to generate the effects that it wanted is to look at the velocity of money. Some people like the velocity of money as an indicator, some people don't, but that's not the issue now. I'm just simply trying to illustrate how ineffective it's been in the last few years. So theoretically, the idea was that you need to generate more economic activity, and of course the velocity has to do with the ratio between gross national product and M2, in this case, the monetary aggregate. So ideally, if this policy is going to work, you're going to get the velocity accelerating, of course, because it has to do with transactions of monetary units. If you have more economic activity, it means you're having more transactions. So that's the entire purpose of this policy. And look what's been happening. I mean, year after year after year, the velocity simply collapsed. So you would have thought after 1 or 2 or 3 years, they would have said, well, this is not working, right? Well, no. They said this is not working because we're not pushing hard enough. So they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. So the excess reserves kept going up and the velocity kept going down. I mean, absolutely amazing that people who have, PhDs, who've been at this for decades, who've worked very hard at this, who've looked at history, who know their theory or supposedly know their theory, should be behaving in this infantile way. But that's what's been happening. And of course, the people who were the infantile ones, just everyday people, average folks, were of course much more knowledgeable about the truth than the government. And so what they were doing is being very cautious. I'm really sorry because I'm sure you can't really see very well what's happening, but I'm just going to simply describe it. On the left, what you have is, of course, private sector credit. Again, the idea was you wanted to boost credit on a massive scale. If you increase the monetary aggregates massively through a massive increase in the monetary stock, you're going to get a lot of credit going around. Okay? That was the theory, that was the idea. And of course, that didn't happen. Credit went up, private credit went up, but in very small percentages, 28% over a 7-8 year period. And of course, the excess reserves quadrupled, quintupled. So clearly a complete imbalance between one and the other. So this is simply basically people telling us, I want to be cautious. I want to deleverage. I'm too much in debt. I want to be careful. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm scared about the future. I want to be cautious. Okay, and the government is saying, don't be cautious, don't be cautious, don't be cautious. And people are saying, look, I want to be cautious. It's such a common sense notion, and politicians simply don't get it. And on the right, you have, pretty much the same story. You can't see there, but the two lines, not the bars, just look at the lines if you can see the lines. It's basically consumer credit, one of them, the darker one, and the other one is mortgages. So again, if this policy was going to work, you're supposed to be seeing those lines go up and up and up and up. That's the whole point of the policy. Look at where they are. That's people simply behaving in a cautious way. That's all it is. And why are they behaving in a cautious way? Because of what the bars tell us. The bars tell us how much in debt they are. That's the amount of leverage they have. So they have such huge leverage, they're so much in debt, they want to be careful. That's what you do when you run into too much debt, right? And despite the government pushing them to get into more debt, they're just telling you, look, I already have enough debt. And yes, if you look at the colors there, the red is consumer credit, the blue is home mortgages, and that has hardly gone down at all in the last several years. So it means we still have a huge amount of debt. So what's really happening is the government is telling them, get into further debt, get into more debt. And the people are saying, let me deleverage, let me breathe, let me get some oxygen into the room, and then I'll start behaving like I did in pre-recession time. So there's this contradictory dynamic going on. I can't prove this, I can't prove what you can't see, but I am pretty certain that if these policies had not been in place, those bars would have gone down significantly by now. And people would have felt much more confident about the future, and therefore they would probably be engaging in more economic activity. So the contradictory dynamic of people's common sense and government's lack of common sense is generating a situation in which the bars are pretty much at the same level they've been for years now. So that's that's really basically a way of saying it's going to take a long time to get out of this situation. If you want those bars to come down significantly, and they've been at that level for several years, you really need a complete change of focus, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. The Americans are not Martians. They behave like normal people. So do the Europeans. So the Europeans are not doing anything different than the Americans. Again, if you look at household credit here, look the level at which it is today, and it's even below 2010. The whole purpose of the policy of the European Central Bank was to get people to get credit flowing again, and it's not happening. Look where it is. People are being cautious. People are being careful. People are being just normal human beings, just like you and I. Well, I'm not sure libertarians are normal human beings, but anyway. The idea is that there's a complete lack of respect on the part of the state towards people's subjective choices. What we were talking about this morning. There's this idea that there's an objective way of getting out of this, and there's a sort of standard to which people should be held in terms of personal conduct, and then we just ram it down their necks and see if they're going to understand. And if they don't understand, then we try even harder from the point of view of government. And people are desperately telling them, why do you have a little bit more respect about my personal choices, my personal psychology, my personal fears, my personal way of looking at my own situation and of anticipating the future. So this, at heart, it's really a massive contradiction in terms of communication. There's a total lack of communication between power and the individual. That's what this monetary story is really telling us. And this is very scary. So, what's even more amazing to me is that this has happened. We've been there before. We've been there so many times in history. All we had to do is look at history to see what would happen. Look at Japan. I'm really sorry about this slide. I know it's not very focused at all. But anyway, what it tells us is just look at the red line. The red line is simply, again, monetary policy as an instrument of getting out of recession. The Japanese thought if we boost the monetary base, we're going to get people to spend and people to engage in economic activity. So they've been expanding it for years and years and years and years. And at the same time, what was the response of the people, of ordinary people? Well, look at the lowest line there. I think it's a blue line. And that's basically bank loans. Look at what was happening. The market was telling the government, we're going to do exactly the opposite of what you were trying to get us to do. And again, this was happening year after year after year. All the US and the Europeans had to do was look at Japan. Unless they thought the Japanese were very strange kind of human beings, they should have simply learned the lesson of what happened in Japan after 1999. And they couldn't care less about what happened in Japan. Probably they thought, well, Japan didn't try hard enough, so we're going to try even harder to tell the individual, from the point of view of the state, what he or she should be doing in this kind of situation. Again, we didn't really need to go that far. Just look at the Great Recession, the Great Depression, in the 1930s. We have a pretty much similar story. Look at the excess reserves there. There's this notion that, and I think it's almost a misreading of Friedman, but in any case, Friedmanites really rather contributed to this notion that, of course, throughout the entire decade, monetary policy didn't help. Well, look at the effort that the central bank was making in all those years. Look at the excess reserves, except for a brief period in 1937, the excess reserves piling up there. That reflects the effort on the part of the Fed to try and get economic activity going through monetary policy. Again, it was a huge misreading of very recent history, because what got the United States into that situation was, of course, in part monetary policy in the 1920s. The 1920s is a time where the monetary base expanded about 60%. And of course, as Austrians know, the expansion of credit on a scale like that is going to lead to a recession eventually, and a major one in this case. And of course, you make things worse if you engage in statist policies once that happens. One way to engage in a statist policy, of course, is to use the power of the state, the monetary power of the state, to try and get things going in civil society. So I think the situation has gotten to a point where we need to really simplify matters so we understand what's been happening in the last few years. So, and where things are going. We started with the manipulation of short-term rates. Really, that's what happened in the beginning. Then, when we realized that was not working, we looked at a longer-term rate. So we started buying all sorts of assets that central banks don't really usually buy. So longer-term assets. And again, that didn't work. So now we're talking about helicopter money, of course. We want the combination of Keynesian and monetarist policy. So we want to help the central government spend more money. In order to do that, we need to basically generate money out of thin air and lend it to the government. So basically the government lending money to itself, of course. So what's going to happen after that? Well, history is difficult to predict. People's conducts are difficult to predict. So I'm not in the business of predicting things. But if we look at history, it looks as if we eventually, first of all, we're going to postpone the recovery even further. And eventually, beyond that, we're looking at major inflation. Unless the government simply cleans up all the mess by withdrawing all that money. If you do that on a colossal scale, in the same colossal scale in which they have created that money, I imagine we're going to create a colossal recession again. So it's very hard to get out of this labyrinth in which we've been trapped by this illusion of recovery through fiscal and, in this case, monetary policy. Just to give you an example of the distortions that this is causing and the assault that this is generating on private property. About 30% of government-issued debt is now has now negative yields. Just think of that. 30%, almost 1/3, has negative yields. The same thing has happened with investment grade, and this is the irony, investment grade corporate debt is generating negative yields, 30% of it. Why? Because central governments have been buying corporate debt, particularly in this case the European Central Bank has been buying a lot of government. I mean, is that the role of government? If you think about the role of government, we can disagree about it, we can have different notions, but nobody, if you stop anybody in the street, or if you survey academics, nobody would come up with this response. What's the role of government? Buying investment-grade corporate bonds. Nobody would come up with this answer, I'm pretty sure. Well, that's exactly what it's been doing. So now the situation is so absurd that in Germany, important companies are issuing debt with negative yields. Not only are yields going negative in the marketplace already, no, actually companies are issuing debt with negative yields. That's amazing. So I'm lending you money, and I have to pay you because I'm lending you money. If that's not an assault on private property, you will tell me, well, it's a voluntary. Well, it's voluntary. I mean, that's not how incentives works, you see, because I'm pushing you and pushing you and pushing and pushing you and forcing you to accept negative yields. So it's not exactly voluntary. But in any case, this is the distorted environment in which we're making decisions as individuals. That framework is one of, I think, a major threat on liberty and freedom, and one that's particularly perverse because it's very difficult to see. It's becoming clearer and clearer, by the way, year after year. But still, a lot of people don't get this. A lot of people don't see the connection between what's happening and government policy yet. And I think that is aggravating things. We're in a situation in which central banks are buying stocks. The Swiss central bank, not the Peruvian central bank, the Swiss central bank, is actually trying to boost the stock market. Well, they claim they're actually they don't believe in bonds anymore, so they're buying stock. So this is wonderful. The central banks create a mess in the bond market, so they no longer believe in bonds, so they buy stocks. Okay? That's what's happening now. The Japanese government, I showed you that slide. The Japanese government now owns 10% of the Nikkei 225 index. Can you believe that? 10% of the major stock market index is owned by the central bank in Japan. Not by, ordinary Japanese investing in the stock market, investing in their companies. No, providing money to those companies so those companies can make capital investments for the future. No, the role of government has replaced civil society, even in the stock market. I mean, quite confusing. So I want to go beyond monetary policy now. I'm going to go into I don't know how much more time I have, but anyway, there's another area where I think things are going in the wrong direction. But again, in a way that's not exactly visible, that's not easy to see, easy to spot. And I think it's also very perverse. And it has to do with protectionism. I think we're back in a protectionist mindset generally everywhere, but particularly in the developed world. And I think this is very, very dangerous. It's now become respectable to be protectionist again. There was a few years ago, people were protectionist. By people, I mean leaders and people who influence other people. But they didn't accept that they were protectionist. It was a fascinating game of concealing the true nature of the policy that was being espoused by these leaders. So I espouse protectionist policies, but I don't admit it. No, now we're in a different terrain altogether. Now we're admitting it. Now we're proud of it. You look at the American campaign, and it's fascinating. I don't know if you saw the WikiLeaks the other day about what Hillary Clinton told the Goldman Sachs. No, it wasn't Goldman Sachs. It was a Brazilian bank. She said, "I want a hemisphere, presumably talking about the Western Hemisphere, that is completely free. We have the free circulation of goods and services and people. That's my dream." So that's wonderful. And yet, what is she saying on the campaign trail? She's opposing every type of trade deal that's ever been. She has assumed a completely protectionist language. Why? Because if she didn't do that, if she hadn't done that, she would not have been able to beat Sanders, who was the protectionist, the real protectionist in that internal election, in those primaries. And of course, on the right, we have a situation in which originally Trump was the only guy being protectionist. Some of the others were, well, they were protectionists, but they didn't admit it. Now, so many people are protectionists in the Republican Party that it's become fashionable to be protectionist. And if you're not protectionist, you become marginalized. You're ashamed into admitting that you are not a protectionist. So very dangerous. And this whole thing stems, on the left and the right, from a misreading of history in the United States, of economic history. There are many reasons of how they justify this policy or these policies. But a major one has to do with the manufacturing decline of the United States. The idea that manufacturing has declined essentially because of free trade. We have gone too far down the free trade line, so we are now generating a situation in which it is impossible for the United States to compete, and that has generated the collapse of U.S. manufacturing industries, and that has generated sort of permanent unemployment in certain areas of the country. Of course, this is very localized, but in certain areas of the country. This is the established truth in large parts of the mainstream political mainstream in the United States. And it's a complete absurdity. The manufacturing decline started long before these free trade agreements, long before NAFTA, which was in the 1990s, long before the World Trade Organization, which came into being in 1995. The manufacturing decline has been happening since the 1970s. And it has to do with very different factors. I don't want to go into this at great length, but it has to do with technology, which makes it productive to do more things with less people in some cases, and we know that the market can reabsorb those people in other types of industries, but again, it has to do with the expansion of the economy thanks to technology. It has to do, yes, with the emergence of some of these emerging countries. It's a very crazy idea to think that only a few countries will be prosperous or achieve prosperity forever and ever and ever. No, you will have new countries becoming prosperous and imitating the things that need to be imitated and doing the things that need to be done. And so when that happens, is good for everybody, right? Well, no, it's not good for everybody. So the emergence of these countries has destroyed the manufacturing base of the United States, so we need to protect ourselves and defend ourselves with barriers. It's a war. Essentially, it's become respectable, again, through these kinds of arguments to defend protectionist policies. And look what's been happening. So one of the consequences of this is the enlargement of the gap between those two lines below and those two lines on the top. I don't know if you can see them very clearly, but the lines below, the green and the light green, basically reflect rich country flows, and the top lines, global flows. So if you look at what was happening a few years ago, the two were much closer together, simply because it meant that rich countries and developed countries were the ones moving things, getting things moving. There was a lot of trade and a lot of investment happening because those countries were espousing relatively free trade. But now there's a gap growing between global flows and developed country flows. And that gap is growing because of protectionism, of course. We are impeding, we're hampering, we're putting obstacles in the way of investment and trade in the developed world. So the developed world is going to be moving in a different direction than some of the emerging countries that are a little bit freer in terms of trade, or at least are pushing in that direction, or want to push in that direction. The amount of measure, since 2008, since the beginning of the financial crisis, about 4,000 measures against free trade have been passed and approved and adopted. 4,000. It's a huge amount, right? And if you look specifically at capital goods, at investment goods, the ratio between
measures that liberalize that trade and measures that hamper or restrict that trade is 10 to 1 in favor of measures that restrict that kind of trade. So if the idea is to get investment going, and we're pushing 10 times more measures that hamper and obstruct trade than measures that liberalize trade, clearly we're not going to get there. So we're going exactly in the opposite direction. And if you ask anybody, politicians, opinion leaders, whether we're living in a protectionist era, they will say, no, protectionism, that was 1930s. We're in a much freer era today. Well, we may not have the kind of spiraling protectionism we had in the 30s, but we have a creeping protectionism that I think is in many ways more perverse. And what's even worse is it's accelerating. Since the beginning of this year, we've seen about 350, if I'm not wrong, 350 measures against trade, against free trade, against the free circulation of goods and services passed. That's a lot of measures in just a few months, in about 8 months or so. So it's getting worse. It's getting much worse. And I think it has to do with pretty much everybody. I mean, the BRIC countries and emerging countries are doing the same thing. But I think developed countries in particular are to blame for this. Look at this slide and look at the bars there. If you look at the green, that's the richest countries. And they are making the greatest contribution today to protectionism. And again, very few people would accept that. That's the whole idea of running a campaign for protectionism. That we've had free trade in the last few years, now we need protection. That's what Trump is saying, that's what Sanders had been saying, that's what Hillary is saying now. Well, no, look at the last few years and look at the green there. The rich countries are the most protectionist countries today. And they have been for several years now, despite what Trump and Hillary and Sanders have been saying, and what many European leaders have been saying. Who is the worst culprit here? Well, everybody is to blame, but look at that. Look at the United States. This is the number of protectionist measures since the G20 began. You know, the G20 was one of the consequences of the financial crisis, right? The whole sort of international architecture that was born out of the crisis is very much exemplified by the G20. Well, look at the United States. So when Trump is telling the people, we need protectionist measures, he's not realizing that the United States is already there in many ways. So imagine how much worse things will become receiving areas in the United States. So much so that in about 30 years' time, maybe 40, Asians will comprise about 38%, almost 40% of the immigrant population in the United States, and Hispanics only 31%. Nobody knows this, at least to judge by what's being said on the campaign trail. So what do these things have in common? They have in common the huge gap between truth and what's being espoused, truth and what is being said and what is being mythified through political actors, through journalists, through some academics, through people who have influence on other people. So we're living in times of immense confusion and immense illusion, and I think that makes our work tremendously challenging. Thank you very much.